No maid lasted more than 24 hours in this house. Not one. Some walked out in anger, slamming doors behind them as if trying to escape something they couldn't explain. Others left in tears, shaking, refusing to even collect their final pay. And a few didn't even make it past breakfast. At the center of it all was a 12-year-old girl named Lena Whitmore, the daughter of a powerful millionaire, Charles Whitmore, a man known in business circles as disciplined, brilliant, and completely untouchable. Inside his home, however, things told a different story. Lena wasn't just difficult. She was feared by every employee who stepped through those polished doors. Not because she raised her voice, but because of the way she looked at people, as if she had already decided they didn't matter. And no one could understand why. Because behind the tantrums, the silence, and the cold, cutting words, there was something far deeper at play in that house. Something no one had taken the time to truly see. And when one woman finally refused to quit, she uncovered a truth no one was prepared for. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Whitmore estate stood quietly on the outskirts of a wealthy American suburb, surrounded by tall iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges that gave the illusion of order and control. From the outside, it looked like a place where nothing could go wrong. Inside, however, there was a pattern that no one could ignore. Over the course of just 6 months, 11 different maids had been hired and had all left within a single day. Some stayed only hours. The agency that supplied staff to the Whitmore home had started warning new applicants, but the pay was too high to resist. Each person believed they would be the exception. Each person believed they could handle one young girl. And every single one of them was wrong. The reports were always similar, yet never fully explained. Lena refused to eat meals prepared for her, often pushing plates away without a word. She ignored instructions, dismissed greetings, and when spoken to directly, she responded with words that felt far too sharp for a child her age. One former maid described the experience as unsettling, saying it felt like working for someone much older, someone who had already decided how the world worked and saw no reason to change it. Another said Lena never raised her voice, which somehow made everything worse. There were no outbursts, no obvious tantrums, just a steady, quiet resistance that wore people down until they couldn't take it anymore. Charles Whitmore, meanwhile, remained largely absent from these events. His days were filled with meetings, travel, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond the walls of his home. When informed about the staff leaving, his responses were brief and practical. Replace them. Increase the pay if necessary. Ensure the house runs smoothly. There was no anger in his tone, no urgency, just the expectation that the problem would be handled like any other inconvenience. To him, it was a staffing issue. To everyone else, it felt like something entirely different. It was during this cycle that a woman named Margaret Hayes entered the picture. Margaret was not new to domestic work. She had spent over 2 decades managing households, raising children that were not her own, and stepping into spaces where others had given up. She was in her late 50s, calm in her movements, steady in her voice, and known for something that couldn't easily be listed on a resume. She paid attention. When the agency told her about the Whitmore home, they didn't hide the truth. They told her no one lasted. They told her the girl was difficult. They told her she would likely be back within a day. Margaret listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then accepted the position without hesitation. From the moment she arrived, Margaret noticed what others had overlooked. The house was immaculate, almost too perfect, as if everything had been arranged to avoid disruption. The staff moved quietly, speaking only when necessary. There was no warmth in their interactions, no casual conversation, just a constant sense of caution. And then there was Lena, sitting alone at the far end of a long dining table, untouched breakfast in front of her, staring not at the food, but at nothing in particular. When Margaret introduced herself, Lena didn't respond. She didn't even look up. For most, this would have been the beginning of frustration. For Margaret, it was the beginning of a question. As the hours passed, the pattern began to reveal itself. Lena ignored instructions, dismissed requests, and responded to attempts at conversation with silence or brief, cutting remarks. But Margaret didn't react the way the others had. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insist on obedience. Instead, she observed. She noticed how Lena flinched, almost imperceptibly, when someone moved too quickly near her. She noticed how the girl avoided eye contact, not out of defiance, but out of something closer to discomfort. She noticed how the untouched food remained on the table long after everyone else had finished eating. By midday, the tension in the house had already begun to build. One of the staff members quietly asked Margaret how long she planned to stay. There was no judgment in the question, just curiosity shaped by experience. Margaret's answer was simple: as long as it takes. It was the kind of response that didn't fit the pattern, and it didn't go unnoticed. For the first time in months, something in the routine had shifted, even if only slightly. Later that afternoon, Lena finally spoke directly to Margaret. It wasn't a greeting or a question. It was a command, brief, cold, and delivered without looking at her. Most would have taken offense. Most would have responded with authority or walked away. Margaret did neither. She followed the instruction, calmly, without resistance, and without changing her expression. It was a small moment, but it marked the first time Lena's behavior had not resulted in immediate conflict. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, Lena noticed. As evening approached, something happened that no previous maid had stayed long enough to see. Lena's composure began to crack. It started with a simple request that went unanswered. Then another. When Margaret finally responded, not with urgency, but with quiet steadiness, Lena's reaction shifted. The cold distance gave way to something sharper, something closer to frustration. And then, for just a moment, something else appeared. Something that didn't match the image everyone had built of her. Margaret didn't push. She didn't ask questions. She simply stayed. And in that decision, something began to change. Not all at once, not in a way that anyone could immediately point to, but enough to suggest that the story of Lena Whitmore was far from what it seemed. Because for the first time, someone wasn't trying to manage her. Someone was trying to understand her. And that difference would uncover a truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Writing. Charles Whitmore was the kind of man people spoke about with a mix of admiration and distance, a self-made millionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the country. He built his fortune through precision, discipline, and an ability to make decisions without hesitation. Those who worked with him described him as fair but unreachable, a man who valued results above all else. His schedule was relentless, filled with early flights, late meetings, and constant demands that kept him away from home more often than he was present. To the outside world, Charles Whitmore represented success in its purest form. But inside the walls of his own home, his presence felt more like an absence, something noticed only when it was missing rather than when it was there. The Whitmore estate reflected everything Charles had achieved, a sprawling property designed to impress at first glance and intimidate at second. Every detail was carefully maintained, from the polished floors to the perfectly arranged furniture that looked as though it had never been used. There was no clutter, no signs of chaos, no indication that anything in that house was out of place. And yet, beneath that controlled appearance, there was a quiet tension that lingered in every room. The staff moved with caution, their voices low, their interactions brief, as if they were all aware of something they couldn't openly discuss. Doors were closed softly, footsteps were measured, and no one stayed longer than they had to. The turnover of employees had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just frequent, it was constant. New faces appeared in the morning and were gone before the next day began. The staff quarters, though fully furnished and prepared, often sat empty, a silent reminder of how quickly people chose to leave. Suitcases were packed in a hurry, conversations cut short, and explanations rarely given in full. Those who left didn't want to talk about it, and those who remained didn't ask. It created an unspoken understanding that whatever was happening in that house was better left alone. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, even when people try to look away. At the center of that pattern was Lena Whitmore. At 12 years old, she carried herself with a composure that didn't match her age, moving through the house with quiet certainty, as if she already knew how every interaction would unfold. She didn't seek attention, and she didn't respond to it either. Kindness seemed to pass through her without effect, while discipline only reinforced the distance she kept from everyone around her. When spoken to, she either ignored the words completely or responded with a tone that felt rehearsed, controlled, and final. There was no hesitation in her voice, no second guessing, just a firm sense that she had already decided how much of herself she was willing to give, which was almost nothing. What made Lena difficult to understand wasn't just her behavior, but the consistency of it. There were no moments of warmth that hinted at a different side of her, no sudden changes that could be explained as mood or temperament. Every interaction followed the same pattern, calm on the surface, but cutting underneath. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, and she didn't demand attention. Instead, she created a space where people felt unnecessary, where their presence seemed to have no impact at all. And over time, that feeling became too much for most to handle. Those who tried to connect with her often found themselves frustrated by the lack of response. A greeting would go unanswered. A question would be met with silence. An attempt at guidance would be dismissed without acknowledgement. It wasn't open defiance, but something more controlled, something that suggested she wasn't reacting in the moment, but following a pattern she had already learned. And that pattern didn't change, no matter who walked through the door. The agencies that supplied staff to the Whitmore estate began to take notice. Reports were filed, concerns were raised, and yet the cycle continued. Each new hire arrived with confidence, believing they would be different, believing they would find a way to reach Lena where others had failed. And each one left with the same quiet understanding that this was not a problem that could be solved with patience alone. Something deeper was holding everything in place, something that shaped every interaction before it even began. Even within the structure of the household, there was a clear distance between Lena and her father. Charles Whitmore ensured that everything she needed was provided for, from education to comfort, but their interactions were brief and often limited to routine exchanges. There were no long conversations, no shared moments that hinted at a deeper connection. It was as if both of them had accepted a version of their relationship that required little from either side. To an outsider, it might have seemed functional. To those who spent time in that house, it felt incomplete. Margaret Hayes began to see all of this not as separate issues, but as parts of the same pattern. The silence, the distance, the constant turnover, and Lena's behavior were all connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious but became clearer the longer she observed. This wasn't just a difficult child creating a challenging work environment. This was something structured, something repeated, something that had been allowed to continue for far too long without being truly understood. And as Margaret moved through the house, paying attention to the smallest details that others had overlooked, one thought became impossible to ignore. Charles Whitmore was the kind of man people spoke about with a mix of admiration and distance, a self-made millionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the country. He built his fortune through precision, discipline, and an ability to make decisions without hesitation. Those who worked with him described him as fair but unreachable, a man who valued results above all else. His schedule was relentless, filled with early flights, late meetings, and constant demands that kept him away from home more often than he was present. To the outside world, Charles Whitmore represented success in its purest form. But inside the walls of his own home, his presence felt more like an absence, something noticed only when it was missing rather than when it was there. The Whitmore estate reflected everything Charles had achieved, a sprawling property designed to impress at first glance and intimidate at second. Every detail was carefully maintained, from the polished floors to the perfectly arranged furniture that looked as though it had never been used. There was no clutter, no signs of chaos, no indication that anything in that house was out of place. And yet, beneath that controlled appearance, there was a quiet tension that lingered in every room. The staff moved with caution, their voices low, their interactions brief, as if they were all aware of something they couldn't openly discuss. Doors were closed softly, footsteps were measured, and no one stayed longer than they had to. The turnover of employees had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just frequent, it was constant. New faces appeared in the morning and were gone before the next day began. The staff quarters, though fully furnished and prepared, often sat empty, a silent reminder of how quickly people chose to leave. Suitcases were packed in a hurry, conversations cut short, and explanations rarely given in full. Those who left didn't want to talk about it, and those who remained didn't ask. It created an unspoken understanding that whatever was happening in that house was better left alone. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, even when people try to look away. At the center of that pattern was Lena Whitmore. At 12 years old, she carried herself with a composure that didn't match her age, moving through the house with quiet certainty, as if she already knew how every interaction would unfold. She didn't seek attention, and she didn't respond to it either. Kindness seemed to pass through her without effect, while discipline only reinforced the distance she kept from everyone around her. When spoken to, she either ignored the words completely or responded with a tone that felt rehearsed, controlled, and final. There was no hesitation in her voice, no second-guessing, just a firm sense that she had already decided how much of herself she was willing to give, which was almost nothing. What made Lena difficult to understand wasn't just her behavior, but the consistency of it. There were no moments of warmth that hinted at a different side of her, no sudden changes that could be explained as mood or temperament. Every interaction followed the same pattern, calm on the surface, but cutting underneath. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, and she didn't demand attention. Instead, she created a space where people felt unnecessary, where their presence seemed to have no impact at all. And over time, that feeling became too much for most to handle. Those who tried to connect with her often found themselves frustrated by the lack of response. A greeting would go unanswered. A question would be met with silence. An attempt at guidance would be dismissed without acknowledgement. It wasn't open defiance, but something more controlled, something that suggested she wasn't reacting in the moment, but following a pattern she had already learned. And that pattern didn't change, no matter who walked through the door. The agencies that supplied staff to the Whitmore estate began to take notice. Reports were filed, concerns were raised, and yet the cycle continued. Each new hire arrived with confidence, believing they would be different, believing they would find a way to reach Lena where others had failed. And each one left with the same quiet understanding that this was not a problem that could be solved with patience alone. Something deeper was holding everything in place, something that shaped every interaction before it even began. Even within the structure of the household, there was a clear distance between Lena and her father. Charles Whitmore ensured that everything she needed was provided for, from education to comfort, but their interactions were brief and often limited to routine exchanges. There were no long conversations, no shared moments that hinted at a deeper connection. It was as if both of them had accepted a version of their relationship that required little from either side. To an outsider, it might have seemed functional. To those who spent time in that house, it felt incomplete. Margaret Hayes began to see all of this not as separate issues, but as parts of the same pattern. The silence, the distance, the constant turnover, and Lena's behavior were all connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious but became clearer the longer she observed. This wasn't just a difficult child creating a challenging work environment. This was something structured, something repeated, something that had been allowed to continue for far too long without being truly understood. And as Margaret moved through the house, paying attention to the smallest details that others had overlooked, one thought became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a difficult child, this was a pattern. The pattern didn't unfold all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, in moments that seemed small on their own but became impossible to ignore when placed side by side. Before Margaret Hayes arrived, the Whitmore estate had already seen a steady rotation of women who came in hopeful and left unsettled. Each one entered the house with quiet confidence, believing they had the patience and experience to manage a 12-year-old girl. And each one, within hours, found themselves questioning something they couldn't quite explain. One of the first had been a woman named Claire, soft-spoken and attentive, the kind who believed kindness could reach anyone if given enough time. She greeted Lena Whitmore warmly that morning, placing a carefully prepared breakfast in front of her and asking simple, polite questions. Lena didn't respond. Not with words, not with a glance, not even with the smallest acknowledgement that someone was speaking to her. Claire tried again, adjusting her tone, offering options, suggesting alternatives. Nothing changed. Minutes passed, then longer. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, not just for Claire, but for everyone within earshot. And when Lena finally spoke, it was without emotion, without hesitation. "Don't talk to me." The words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to end the interaction immediately. Claire didn't argue. She simply stepped back, unsure of what had just happened, and by midday, she was gone. Another came days later, more assertive, less willing to be dismissed. Her name was Denise, and she approached the situation with structure and expectation. She believed in clear boundaries, in setting rules and following through with them. When Lena ignored her instructions, Denise responded with firmness, repeating herself, raising her voice just enough to make it clear she expected compliance. Lena didn't react. She continued as if the words hadn't been spoken, moving through the room with the same quiet certainty that had unsettled others before. Denise followed her, insisting, pressing, trying to establish control. And then Lena stopped, turned slightly, and said just enough to shift the balance completely. "You're useless." There was no anger in her tone, no frustration, just a statement delivered with calm precision. It was the kind of response that didn't invite argument, only reflection. Denise stood there for a moment, caught between reacting and walking away. By the end of the afternoon, she had packed her things without another word. The stories continued, each one slightly different, but ending the same way. A younger woman tried to connect through conversation, only to be met with silence so complete it felt intentional. Another attempted to engage Lena through activities, suggesting games, offering distractions, trying to create some form of interaction. Lena declined each attempt without explanation, leaving the room before the conversation could fully begin. There were moments when the tension escalated, when frustration surfaced, when voices were raised. But Lena never matched that energy. She remained composed, distant, and entirely unaffected by the reaction she caused. One incident stood out more than the others, not because it was louder or more dramatic, but because of how quickly it unfolded. A maid named Patricia had been in the house for less than 3 hours. She had been given a simple task, something routine, something that should have passed without issue. When she approached Lena to confirm a detail, Lena looked at her briefly and said a single word: "Leave." It wasn't framed as a request or even a command that needed to be repeated. It was final. Patricia hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly, and in that moment of hesitation, Lena turned away, ending the interaction entirely. Within minutes, Patricia was speaking to the house manager, her voice unsteady, her explanation incomplete. She didn't stay long enough to elaborate. As these moments accumulated, they began to form a pattern that extended beyond individual experiences. It wasn't just that Lena was difficult. It was that every interaction followed a structure that left no room for change. Kindness didn't reach her. Authority didn't influence her. Persistence didn't wear her down. Each approach met the same outcome, as if the result had been decided long before anyone walked through the door. And for those who experienced it, the effect was the same. Confusion at first, then frustration, and finally a quiet decision to leave. One former maid, after gathering her belongings and preparing to walk out for the last time, paused long enough to say something that stayed with the staff long after she was gone. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't try to explain everything she had experienced. She simply looked at the house manager and said, "There's something wrong in that house." It wasn't said with anger or fear, but with certainty, as if she had recognized something others had only felt without understanding. That sentence didn't offer answers. It didn't point to a specific cause or reveal anything concrete, but it changed the way the situation was perceived. Because until that moment, the focus had been on Lena's behavior, on the way she spoke, the way she acted, the way she pushed people away. What that statement suggested was something different. That the problem wasn't just Lena. That the house itself, the environment, the silence, the distance, all played a role in shaping what was happening. And once that idea took hold, it became impossible to ignore. By the time Margaret Hayes stepped into the Whitmore estate, this pattern had already been firmly established. The stories, the departures, the quiet warnings passed between staff, all pointed to the same conclusion. No one lasted. Not because they weren't capable, but because something within that house made it impossible to stay. And as Margaret moved through those rooms, observing the same details others had seen but not fully understood, she began to realize that the truth behind Lena Whitmore's behavior wasn't something that would reveal itself easily. It would have to be uncovered, piece by piece, through patience, attention, and a willingness to see what others had chosen to walk away from. By the time Margaret Hayes entered the Whitmore estate, the stories had already reached her in full. 11 women had come and gone, each one leaving behind the same quiet uncertainty that no one could fully explain. For most, that would have been enough to walk away before even stepping through the front gate. But Margaret was not most people. At 58 years old, she had spent more than 2 decades working in homes where tension lived beneath the surface, where children acted out in ways that didn't always make sense, and where silence often said more than words ever could. She wasn't drawn to easy work. She was drawn to situations that required patience, attention, and a willingness to stay when others chose to leave. There was nothing rushed about Margaret, nothing reactive in the way she carried herself. Her movements were steady, her voice calm, and her presence grounded in a way that didn't demand attention but naturally held it. She had learned over the years that not every problem needed to be corrected immediately, and not every behavior required a response. Sometimes, the most important thing was simply to observe, to understand the rhythm of a space before trying to change it. It was a way of working that didn't always make sense to others, especially in environments where quick results were expected. But it was precisely what had allowed her to succeed in places where others had struggled. When she accepted the position at the Whitmore estate, she did so without negotiation, without asking for reassurances, and without adjusting her expectations based on what she had been told. The agency had been clear about the situation. They had explained Lena Whitmore's behavior, the rapid turnover of staff, and the likelihood that this job would end as quickly as the others. Margaret listened, nodded, and simply said she would see for herself. It wasn't confidence in the usual sense. It was something quieter, something built on years of experience that had taught her one important truth. People rarely act without reason, even when that reason isn't immediately visible. From the moment she arrived, Margaret approached the house differently. Where others had stepped in with plans, expectations, and strategies, she stepped in with attention. She noticed the way the staff avoided eye contact when Lena's name was mentioned. She noticed how conversations would shift or end entirely when certain topics came too close to something unspoken. She noticed the silence, not just as an absence of sound, but as something maintained, something protected. And most importantly, she noticed Lena Whitmore, not just in the way she behaved, but in the moments between those behaviors. When Lena ignored her introduction, Margaret didn't repeat herself. When Lena dismissed a question, Margaret didn't press for an answer. Where others had reacted with frustration or authority, Margaret chose stillness. It wasn't passive, and it wasn't uncertainty. It was deliberate. She understood that reacting too quickly often reinforced the very patterns she was trying to understand. So instead of correcting Lena, she allowed the interactions to unfold without interference, watching closely, listening carefully, and taking note of what wasn't being said. This approach didn't go unnoticed. The staff, used to a predictable cycle of tension and departure, began to observe Margaret with the same curiosity they had once reserved for Lena. They expected the same outcome, the same breaking point that had come for everyone else. But it didn't arrive, at least not in the way they anticipated. Hours passed, then more, and Margaret remained exactly as she had been when she first walked in. Calm, steady, and entirely unaffected by the behavior that had driven others away. What set Margaret apart wasn't just her experience or her patience. It was her refusal to take Lena's actions at face value. She didn't see defiance where others saw disrespect. She didn't see silence as rejection. Instead, she treated each moment as part of a larger pattern, something that needed to be understood before it could be addressed. And in doing so, she created a different kind of interaction, one that didn't escalate, didn't collapse, but simply existed long enough to reveal something new. There was a moment, late in the afternoon, when Lena gave a brief instruction, her tone as controlled as ever, her words carrying the same quiet finality that had ended so many interactions before. Margaret listened, acknowledged it with a simple nod, and followed through without hesitation or resistance. There was no challenge in her response, no attempt to assert control, just a calm acceptance that didn't disrupt the balance Lena was used to maintaining. For the first time, the pattern didn't repeat itself in the expected way. And for the first time, Lena paused, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed, but just enough to register that something was different. Margaret didn't push that moment further. She didn't try to build on it or turn it into something more. She simply continued, allowing the day to unfold without forcing change. It was a subtle shift, almost invisible, but it marked the beginning of something that hadn't existed in that house for a long time. An interaction that didn't end in conflict, didn't lead to withdrawal, and didn't reinforce the distance that had defined every relationship Lena had experienced. And as the evening settled over the Whitmore estate, with the same quiet tension lingering in the background, one thing became increasingly clear. Margaret Hayes was not there to follow the same path as the others. She wasn't measuring her time in hours or waiting for the moment she would decide to leave. She had stepped into that house with a different purpose, one that extended beyond the expectations of the job itself. Because unlike the others, she wasn't there just for a job. As the hours turned into a full day, Margaret Hayes began to see beyond the surface of what everyone else had already decided about Lena Whitmore. Where others had focused on the words, the tone, and the distance, Margaret focused on the details that didn't fit as neatly into those conclusions. The first thing she noticed was the food. Meals were prepared with care, placed in front of Lena at the same times each day, and almost always left untouched. It wasn't refusal in the usual sense. Lena didn't complain about the taste, didn't push the plate away dramatically, didn't demand something else. She simply didn't eat. She would sit there for a while, staring past the table as if the meal wasn't even there, and then leave without a word. It was consistent, quiet, and easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention. Margaret also noticed the way Lena handled eye contact. It wasn't just that she avoided it, but how deliberately she did so. When someone entered the room, Lena's gaze would shift almost immediately, settling on something distant, something neutral, anything that didn't require direct engagement. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't distraction. It felt practiced, as though eye contact itself carried a weight she had learned to avoid. And on the rare occasions when their eyes did meet, even for a second, there was a brief tension in Lena's expression, something that disappeared as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that same controlled distance. Certain words seemed to trigger a reaction that didn't match the calm exterior Lena maintained. Simple phrases, the kind most people wouldn't think twice about, caused subtle but noticeable shifts in her behavior. When someone mentioned family, her posture changed. When a question was asked too directly, her responses became shorter, sharper, more final. And when instructions were repeated too firmly, there was a flicker of something deeper, something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't indifference either. Margaret didn't interrupt these moments. She let them pass, storing each one carefully, allowing a pattern to form without forcing it into place too soon. The house itself began to feel different the longer Margaret stayed. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty in a way that went beyond the absence of sound. Conversations were limited to what was necessary, interactions kept brief, and there was a noticeable lack of warmth in even the most routine exchanges. It was as if the house had been arranged not just physically, but emotionally, to avoid anything that might disrupt the fragile balance everyone had learned to maintain. There were no personal touches in the shared spaces, no signs of connection, no evidence that this was a place where people truly lived together. Everything functioned, but nothing felt connected. One of the most striking details was the absence of any clear maternal presence. There were no photos, no references in conversation, no indication that Lena Whitmore had a mother actively involved in her life. It wasn't something the staff discussed openly, and when Margaret attempted to ask in indirect ways, the responses were vague, carefully worded, and quickly redirected. It wasn't just that the information wasn't available. It was that no one seemed willing to explore it further. That absence, combined with the emotional distance that defined the house, created a gap that couldn't easily be ignored. Charles Whitmore's presence, though constant in influence, was rarely felt in real time. He moved in and out of the house according to a schedule that left little room for extended interaction. When he was there, his attention was divided, his conversations brief, and his focus directed elsewhere. There were no visible conflicts between him and Lena, no raised voices or clear disagreements. Instead, there was a distance that seemed to have settled into place over time, something neither of them actively challenged. It wasn't tension in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, something that suggested a connection that had never fully formed or had been lost somewhere along the way. The staff, who had witnessed this pattern longer than anyone, carried their own understanding of the situation, but it was one they rarely shared. When Margaret spoke with them, their responses were careful, measured, and often incomplete. There was a reluctance to say too much, as if acknowledging the full reality of the house would somehow make it harder to continue working within it. They had adapted in their own ways, keeping their distance, limiting their interactions, and focusing only on what was required of them. It wasn't indifference. It was self-preservation. As Margaret moved through each day, observing without forcing change, the pieces began to align in a way that shifted her understanding of Lena Whitmore completely. The silence, the refusal to engage, the controlled responses, all pointed to something that had been misinterpreted from the beginning. This wasn't a child acting out without reason. This wasn't cruelty for the sake of control. It was something far more structured, something that had developed over time as a way of managing an environment that offered little in return. Margaret didn't arrive at this conclusion suddenly. It formed gradually, built from small observations that others had dismissed or overlooked. And when it finally became clear enough to put into words, it changed the direction of everything that followed. Because what she was seeing wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't defiance in the way everyone had assumed. It was a response, a learned behavior shaped by circumstances that no one had taken the time to fully understand. This wasn't arrogance, this was defense. The shift didn't happen gradually. It came all at once, in a moment that broke the quiet control Lena Whitmore had maintained for so long. It began with something small, something that under normal circumstances would have passed without notice. A simple request, repeated twice, then a third time. Margaret Hayes had heard it clearly, but she didn't respond immediately, not out of defiance, but out of intention. She had learned that timing mattered, that reacting too quickly often reinforced patterns that needed space to reveal themselves. But this time, something was different. Lena's posture changed first. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone who hadn't been paying close attention. Her shoulders stiffened, her hands tightened slightly at her sides, and for a brief moment, the calm expression she carried so carefully began to slip. When Margaret finally responded, her tone steady and calm, it didn't have the effect Lena expected. There was no urgency, no correction, no emotional reaction to meet or resist. And in that absence, something inside Lena shifted. The reaction came without warning. A glass set near the edge of the table, untouched like so many things in that house. Lena reached for it suddenly, her movement sharp and unrestrained, and before there was time to stop her, it hit the floor with a force that shattered it instantly. The sound cut through the silence, echoing through the room in a way that demanded attention. For the first time since Margaret had arrived, Lena's control gave way completely. Her breathing quickened, her expression no longer distant but overwhelmed, and the calm precision that had defined her behavior disappeared. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something that had been held back for far too long. Words followed, not measured or controlled, but rushed and uneven, as if they had been waiting for an opening. She spoke without looking at Margaret, her voice unsteady, her tone shifting between frustration and something closer to fear. It wasn't directed in a way that made sense on the surface. There was no clear argument, no specific complaint, just a release of emotion that didn't match the situation in front of her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence was different. Lena stood still, her expression changing once more, the intensity draining from her face as quickly as it had appeared. She didn't look at the broken glass. She didn't acknowledge what had just happened. Instead, she stepped back, her posture closing in on itself, her gaze dropping away from everything around her. The same distance returned, but now it carried something else with it. Not control, but withdrawal. Margaret didn't move immediately. She didn't rush to clean the mess or fill the silence with questions. She stayed exactly where she was, watching carefully, allowing the moment to settle without interruption. What she had just seen wasn't a loss of control in the way others might have described it. It was something more revealing. A break in the pattern that had been maintained so carefully, followed by an immediate attempt to restore it. In that moment, the pieces Margaret had been gathering began to align in a way that left little room for doubt. The silence, the distance, the refusal to engage, none of it was random. It wasn't about pushing people away in the way everyone had assumed. It was about something else entirely, something that had shaped every interaction before it even began. Margaret took a slow step forward, her voice calm, steady, and free of any judgment. She didn't address the broken glass. She didn't comment on the outburst. Instead, she spoke in a way that cut through the confusion of the moment and reached something deeper. "You don't expect them to stay," she said quietly, her words measured, deliberate. Lena didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. For the first time, she remained exactly where she was. Margaret continued, not raising her voice, not changing her tone, simply stating what had become clear. "You're not trying to push people away, you're expecting them to leave." The words settled into the space between them, and for a brief moment, Lena's expression shifted again. It wasn't as dramatic as before, not as visible, but it was there. A recognition, however small, that something had been understood. That realization changed everything, because it meant that Lena's behavior wasn't about control, or defiance, or even indifference. It was about expectation. Every silence, every dismissal, every carefully measured response had been shaped by a belief that no one would stay long enough for anything else to matter. And once that belief was in place, every interaction became a confirmation of it. Margaret didn't press further. She didn't need to. The moment had already revealed more than any direct question could have. And as she stood there, with the broken glass still scattered across the floor and the silence returning once again, one thing became certain. The pattern that had driven everyone else away had finally been understood. And understanding it meant that, for the first time, it could begin to change. After that moment, nothing in the Whitmore estate looked the same to Margaret Hayes, even though, on the surface, everything remained exactly as it had been. The routines continued, the silence returned, and Lena Whitmore resumed her usual distance as if the outburst had never happened. But Margaret knew better. She had seen something real, something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And more importantly, Lena had allowed that moment to happen in front of her. That alone was a shift no one else had been given. The next morning began like all the others. Breakfast was prepared, placed neatly at the table, and left untouched. Lena sat in her usual position, her posture controlled, her expression unreadable. But this time, Margaret approached differently. She didn't ask Lena to eat. She didn't offer alternatives or repeat instructions. Instead, she sat down across from her, not as an authority figure, not as someone trying to correct behavior, but simply as someone willing to share the same space without expectation. Minutes passed in silence, but it wasn't the same kind of silence that had filled the house before. This one felt intentional, not forced. Lena didn't look up, but she didn't leave either. That alone was enough to confirm what Margaret had begun to understand. This wasn't about resistance. It was about control in an environment where she had very little of it. Every interaction Lena had was shaped by the belief that it would end, that the person in front of her would eventually walk away like all the others. So she stayed ahead of that outcome. She kept her distance, limited her responses, and avoided anything that might create a connection she couldn't rely on. It wasn't rejection. It was preparation. Margaret continued this approach throughout the day. She spoke when necessary, but never more than the moment required. She didn't fill the space with unnecessary words, and she didn't react to Lena's tone or behavior in the way others had. When Lena gave a short, dismissive response, Margaret accepted it without challenge. When Lena ignored her completely, Margaret didn't repeat herself. She allowed each interaction to exist without forcing it into something more. It was a quiet form of consistency, one that didn't demand change but made space for it. The staff began to notice the difference. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't immediate, but it was there. Lena wasn't escalating situations in the same way, and more importantly, Margaret wasn't leaving. Hours turned into a full day, then another. For the first time in months, a maid had stayed beyond the expected limit. There were no announcements, no acknowledgement from Charles Whitmore, but the shift was felt in small, subtle ways. Conversations among the staff became slightly less guarded. Movements through the house became less tense. It was as if the entire environment was waiting to see what would happen next. Late in the afternoon, Lena spoke again, her voice quiet but direct. "You'll leave." It wasn't framed as a question. It was a statement, delivered with the same certainty that had defined all her interactions. Margaret looked at her, not with surprise or defensiveness, but with understanding. "Not today," she replied calmly. There was no attempt to convince, no promise beyond what she could control. Just a simple, honest answer. Lena didn't respond immediately. She looked away, returning to the distance she had built so carefully. But this time, there was something different in the way she held that silence. It wasn't as firm, not as complete. The certainty that had once defined her words now seemed to carry a small amount of hesitation. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you were looking for it. But Margaret saw it clearly. As the days continued, the pattern began to shift in ways no one had expected. Lena still kept her distance, still avoided direct engagement, but the sharp edges of her responses began to soften. The silence remained, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like space, something that could be entered slowly, carefully, without being immediately rejected. And Margaret continued exactly as she had from the beginning. Calm, steady, present. Charles Whitmore began to notice as well, though not in the way others did. He saw the reports, the lack of complaints, the absence of sudden resignations. It was a change in outcome, something measurable, something that fit within the structure he understood. But what he didn't yet see was the process behind it, the quiet, consistent effort that had made that change possible. He remained distant, focused on the results rather than the cause, unaware that the solution to the problem he had tried to manage for months was unfolding in a way he had never considered. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Lena lingered in the same room as Margaret longer than she needed to. There was no task keeping her there, no instruction to follow. She simply stayed, her presence no longer defined entirely by distance. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but it carried more weight than anything that had come before. Because for the first time, Lena wasn't preparing for someone to leave. She was allowing someone to stay. Margaret didn't acknowledge it directly. She didn't draw attention to the change or try to build on it too quickly. She simply remained as she had been from the start, offering consistency in a space that had never known it. And in that consistency, something began to take shape. Not a sudden transformation, not a complete shift, but the beginning of trust, built slowly, carefully, and without the pressure that had caused everything else to fall apart. The Whitmore estate was still quiet. The routines were still in place. Charles Whitmore was still distant, and the staff still moved with caution. But beneath all of that, something had changed. The pattern that had once defined every interaction was no longer fixed. It had been interrupted, not by force, not by authority, but by understanding. And for the first time, that understanding was creating the possibility of something different, something no one in that house had experienced before. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost unnoticeable moments that only someone like Margaret Hayes would recognize for what they were. Lena Whitmore didn't suddenly become warm or expressive, and she didn't abandon the distance she had relied on for so long. But there were shifts, subtle and quiet, that began to break the pattern that had once felt unmovable. It started with her responses. Where there had once been silence, there were now brief answers. Not long conversations, not open engagement, but enough to show that something had changed. A question would no longer be ignored completely. A simple instruction would be acknowledged, even if only with a nod. Margaret didn't react to these changes with excitement or urgency. She treated them the same way she had treated everything else, with calm acceptance and patience. She understood that drawing too much attention to these moments could cause Lena to retreat, to rebuild the distance she had spent so long maintaining. So she allowed the changes to exist without pressure, giving them space to grow at their own pace. And as the days passed, those small moments began to connect, forming something that hadn't been present before. Lena started to remain in the same room longer than necessary. At first, it seemed incidental, as though she simply had nowhere else to be. But over time, it became clear that it was a choice. She would sit quietly while Margaret worked, not speaking, not interfering, but no longer avoiding the space entirely. It was a form of presence that carried more meaning than any words could have. For a child who had built her entire world around distance, choosing to stay was a significant step. There were other moments too. Small, almost hidden acts that revealed a shift in trust. Lena began to eat. Not full meals, not consistently, but enough to show that something had changed in her willingness to engage with the routines around her. She would take a few bites, then stop, as if testing the experience rather than fully committing to it. Margaret never commented on it. She simply continued as she always had, allowing Lena to move forward without feeling observed or judged. The staff noticed the difference, though they struggled to explain it. The tension that had once defined every interaction was no longer as sharp. There were fewer abrupt endings, fewer moments where Lena's behavior forced people to step back or walk away. It wasn't that the challenges had disappeared, but they no longer controlled the entire atmosphere of the house. Something had shifted, and even those who kept their distance could feel it. Charles Whitmore remained largely unaware of the depth of this change. He saw the surface results, the stability in the household, the absence of constant replacements, but he didn't yet see the emotional shift that had made it possible. His interactions with Lena remained brief, structured, and distant, following the same pattern they always had. And yet, even within that limited connection, there were moments where Lena's responses carried a slight difference, a hesitation that suggested something beneath the surface was beginning to move. The most significant moment came without warning, in the quiet of an ordinary evening. Lena was sitting near the window, her usual position, her gaze directed outward, as if focused on something far beyond the walls of the Whitmore estate. Margaret was nearby, occupied with a simple task, not expecting anything beyond the routine they had established. The silence between them was familiar now, no longer heavy, no longer filled with tension. It was simply there, shared without discomfort. Then Lena spoke. Her voice was softer than usual, not as controlled, not as distant. "Are you going to leave too?" The question hung in the air, fragile in a way that none of her previous words had been. It wasn't a statement this time. It wasn't delivered with certainty or distance. It was a question shaped by something deeper, something that had been building quietly beneath the surface of every interaction they had shared. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She understood the weight of what had just been asked, the meaning behind it that extended far beyond the words themselves. This wasn't about the job, or the routine, or the expectations of the house. It was about everything Lena had come to believe over time, every experience that had reinforced the idea that people didn't stay. Lena didn't respond right away. She looked down, her expression shifting in a way that was no longer hidden behind distance or control. There was uncertainty there, but also something else, something that hadn't been present before. A willingness to consider a different outcome, a different pattern than the one she had come to expect. And in that moment, something changed in a way that no one in that house could have predicted. It wasn't a complete transformation. Lena didn't suddenly become open or expressive, and the challenges that had defined her behavior didn't disappear overnight. But the foundation had shifted. The certainty that people would leave was no longer absolute. It had been challenged, quietly but firmly, by someone who had chosen to stay without forcing change. Margaret returned to her task, not pressing the moment further, not trying to build on it too quickly. She understood that trust, once given space to grow, needed time to take hold. And Lena remained where she was, no longer retreating, no longer closing herself off completely. The distance was still there, but it was no longer a barrier that couldn't be crossed. For the first time, the Whitmore estate felt different in a way that went beyond routine or structure. The silence was no longer empty. It carried something new, something fragile but real. And at the center of it all, Lena Whitmore was no longer just the girl no one could handle. She was a child beginning to understand that staying might be possible, and that not every connection had to end the way she had always expected. Writing. In the weeks that followed, the shift within the Whitmore estate became impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud or dramatic, and it didn't arrive in a way that demanded attention. It revealed itself quietly, through consistency, through the absence of what had once defined that house. The cycle that had driven so many people away began to lose its hold. There were no sudden resignations, no hurried goodbyes, no tension-filled mornings where someone quietly decided they couldn't continue. Instead, there was stability, something that had been missing for far too long. Lena Whitmore remained herself in many ways. She was still reserved, still careful with her words, still protective of the space she had created around her. But the sharp edges of her behavior had softened. The silence she carried no longer felt like rejection, but like something she was slowly learning to move beyond. She spoke more often now, not in long conversations, but in small, meaningful exchanges that showed a growing willingness to connect. She no longer avoided every interaction, and when she chose to remain present, it was no longer out of habit, but out of something closer to trust. Margaret Hayes continued exactly as she had from the beginning. She didn't change her approach, didn't push for faster progress, didn't expect more than Lena was ready to give. Her presence remained steady, reliable, and free of pressure. And in that consistency, Lena found something she hadn't experienced before. Not control, not authority, but stability. The kind that didn't disappear without warning. The kind that didn't require her to prepare for the end before anything had even begun. Charles Whitmore began to notice the difference, though it came to him slowly, in fragments that didn't immediately form a complete picture. At first, it was the reports. Fewer issues, fewer concerns, no mention of staff leaving unexpectedly. Then it was the atmosphere of the house itself. The tension that had once been present in every room had eased, replaced by something quieter, something more settled. It wasn't something he could measure in the way he measured his work, but it was there, undeniable once he allowed himself to see it. His interactions with Lena began to change as well, though not all at once. There were moments where she responded differently, where her tone carried less distance, where her presence felt less guarded. It was subtle, but it was enough to make him pause, to notice that something had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. For the first time, the problem he had tried to manage through structure and control was resolving itself through something he hadn't fully understood. There was an evening, not unlike many others, when Charles found Lena in one of the common rooms, sitting quietly as Margaret moved nearby. It wasn't the setting that stood out, but the interaction. Lena spoke, briefly, calmly, and Margaret responded in the same steady way she always had. There was no tension in the exchange, no resistance, no distance that needed to be managed. It was simple, natural, and entirely unfamiliar within those walls. Charles watched for a moment longer than usual, not interrupting, not stepping in, just observing something he hadn't seen before. It was in that moment that he began to understand that the change in his home wasn't the result of stricter rules or better hiring decisions. It was something deeper, something that had been missing long before the staff began to leave. And though he didn't fully grasp it all at once, the realization was enough to shift his attention, to make him more present in ways he hadn't been before. The Whitmore estate remained the same in structure, in appearance, in everything that could be seen from the outside. But within those walls, something fundamental had changed. The pattern that once defined every interaction had been broken, not through force, not through authority, but through understanding and patience. Lena Whitmore was no longer trapped in the expectation that everyone would leave. That belief had been challenged, not with promises, but with consistency, with presence, with someone who had chosen to stay without conditions. And as that understanding began to take hold, something else followed. The early stages of healing, quiet and gradual, but real. It didn't erase what had come before, and it didn't solve everything at once. But it created the possibility for something different, something that could grow over time without being cut short by the same patterns that had once controlled everything. Because in the end, what changed Lena Whitmore wasn't discipline, or control, or even time. It was being understood in a way she never had been before. It was someone seeing beyond her behavior and recognizing the reason behind it, without judgment, without frustration, and without walking away. Sometimes, the hardest people to deal with are the ones who have been hurt the most. If stories like this keep you thinking long after they end, subscribe for more real-life mysteries where one small moment changes everything.